Okay, well, thanks for joining us for our conversation with David Rubenstein, who is, I don't tell me if you get sick of hearing this, David, but I'm going to describe you as a billionaire philanthropist, which is certainly how you're known, I guess, or one of the ways in which you're known. But he's also co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group, a private equity firm, successful by any measure, I believe. And many may know him from his TV shows on Bloomberg, where he's able to talk about his interest in philanthropy and patriotic philanthropy, as he terms it. There's also a forthcoming series on PBS that we'll talk about related to these matters. So we'll get to that. But David, if you don't want to correct anything that I just said about you there, why don't we have you tell us what patriotic philanthropy is?
Okay. I guess in many respects, you could say all philanthropy is patriotic because you're trying to give back to the country. I coined that phrase to try to describe some of the type of philanthropy I've been doing, and that is to remind people of the history and heritage of our country. My theory has been that people should know more about our history and heritage. Our representative democracy is premised on informed citizenry. And if we don't have informed citizens, people don't know how our government works, know about our history, we're not going to have as good a democracy as we should like. So I got into this by serendipity. I went to a viewing of the Magna Carta. I was told it was going to be sold the next night to probably somebody from outside the United States. It was the only copy in private hands and the only copy likely to ever come to the United States on a permanent basis. So to preserve it here, because it was so important as a document that influenced our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, I bought it and put it on permanent loan to the National Archives. When I die, it won't be a loan; they'll have it forever. And I then began buying other historic documents and also putting them on display. For example, the rare copies of Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, which freed slaves, the Constitution, and so forth. And then I got into the habit of trying to fix historic buildings. When the Washington Monument had its earthquake damage, I helped put up the money to fix it, then fixing the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, Monticello, Mount Vernon, Montpelier, um, Arlington House at the top of Arlington Cemetery, the Iwo Jima Memorial, things like that. So together, I said these are basically designed to kind of remind people of the history and heritage of our country. That's what I mean by patriotic philanthropy.
Does that stand in tension with what some others, anyway, in I'll say establishment philanthropy? I'm thinking of, we work at a conservative website and worked for a conservative foundation. 2020 was a difficult year, including for monuments that accorded history a respect. Is patriotic philanthropy, as you describe it, in tension with the way progressives might want philanthropy to be used?
Well, I hope it's not. Essentially, what you're, I think, referring to is that some monuments and memorials have been criticized because they promote people who were either fighting for the Confederacy or were proponents of slavery. Let's use that as a simple standard. Thomas Jefferson, slave owner. George Washington, slave owner. Um, James Madison, slave owner. So why promote these people? Well, I think you can make a distinction between a Washington monument, which is designed to memorialize our first president, the general in our Revolutionary War, the man who presided over the Constitutional Convention, as opposed to a monument designed to promote him for his slavery. In the early part of the 20th century, something called the lost cause was a phenomenon in the South designed to say, well, actually, we did lose the Civil War, but slaves really had a better during before slavery was ended, and we lost the war, but really we were really fighting the war for, I would say, the to protect the Southern way of life and not so much to defend slavery. That's a revision of history that some people may not agree with. And then what happened with the lost cause is that you had things like the Ku Klux Klan became very strong. The president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, segregated the workforce, and put Birth of a Nation in a movie in the White House. And then you began to see more and more monuments and memorials to Civil War leaders in the 20th century. And in fact, in Stone Mountain, which is in my new TV show, we found that that Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, and Robert E. Lee's images were carved into this mountain outside of Atlanta, and it was dedicated by the Vice President of the United States at the time, Spiro Agnew, in 1972. So, which is to say that in 1972, people were still saying, well, the people that fought against our country, really were great Americans. And so, in my view, there's a distinction between monuments to people whose main thing is not slave ownership, and people who are being memorialized principally because they were fighting for the so-called lost cause or slavery. And therefore, when monuments to Robert E. Lee or others are taken down, I think we should go back and recognize that many of those monuments were put up mostly to memorialize the so-called lost cause, but not in all cases. And anyway, so I think there is a distinction.
I guess I was having a more cynically broad interpretation of some of the critiques from progressive. Even, I mean, the Declaration would be considered by them. You would have the same distinction, I guess. But
well, we have to be honest. Look, the Constitution has a birth defect. It basically said slavery is the law of the land, and if we didn't agree to have slavery, there would have been no Constitution. Clearly, the Southern delegates would never have agreed to it, and nor could they have survived politically. So the question is, are we better off for having had a Constitution which preserved slavery initially? Now it obviously doesn't. Or are we better off to have had no better form of government than we had under the Articles of Confederation? So history is not black or white, of course. And I think in the end, those people who would argue the Declaration of Independence or Constitution are racist documents, well, it's easy to throw out the word racist, but I do think that they had flaws in them. Thomas Jefferson wrote a sentence in the Declaration of Independence, which is the most famous sentence in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Well, he wrote that wonderful language. Actually, what he meant was all property Christian men are equal. Now, as that language was interpreted later, it meant all people are supposed to be equal. And so it was an inspiration for other people the way he wrote it. Had he written all white Christian property owning men are equal, probably wouldn't have had the same resonance and would not have become the creed of our country. But when he wrote all men are created equal, it ultimately was taken into mean much more than what he actually intended.
Yeah. Okay, well, why don't we finish up with our part one there and pick up with part two in a bit here.